Wednesday night, 11 p.m. Cold rain over Ellsworth, Ohio. Clinton Hale was driving home after a long shift when he spotted her, a woman sitting motionless beneath the bus shelter on Route 7. No bag, no phone. Soaking wet. Eyes open, fixed on nothing. He pulled over and got out. She didn't react. He took a few steps toward her. Before he could speak, she did, voice calm, almost rehearsed. "Don't take me anywhere they can find me." Then she said his name. His exact name. A stranger, blind, alone in the rain, and she already knew who he was. The night before he found her, Clinton Hale had been standing in his kitchen at 10 o'clock trying to fix a clock that wasn't going to let him. It was a small thing, white face, brass hands, a crack running through the glass like a scar that had never healed right. It had belonged to his wife, Renee. 3 years after her death, it still hung above the kitchen stove hands, frozen at 7:42. He had known how to repair it for almost 2 years. He hadn't. Finishing it felt like closing a door he hadn't decided to close yet. His son, Theo, wandered in from the back hallway barefoot on the cold tile and stood looking at the clock with his arms crossed, the way kids cross their arms when they're pretending to think hard about something. "Why do you keep working on something you know you can't fix, Dad?" Clinton set down his screwdriver. He looked at Theo, 7 years old, round-faced, serious-eyed, with something about the set of his mouth that was pure Renee, and found he had nothing to say. Not because the question was hard, because the answer was already sitting in the room, and he didn't want to hear it spoken out loud. The next morning was Wednesday. He dropped Theo at Ellsworth Elementary, then stopped at the coffee shop on Birch Street before heading to the shop. Darnell Webb was already in his usual corner chair with a newspaper folded to the local section, a cup of black coffee going cold beside him. Darnell was 52, a former federal investigator who had taken early retirement after an injury ended his field work. He and Clinton weren't the kind of friends who talked about feelings. They were the other kind where sitting in silence counted for more than most conversations. Darnell tapped the paper. "Big land company buying up everything east of Orchard Road, out of Columbus, but the money trail stops somewhere else. Nobody local can figure out who the parent company actually is." Clinton poured cream into his coffee. "Rich people problem?" Darnell gave him a look that said he wasn't so sure, then let it go. Clinton had a full day waiting 3 HVAC calls, a broken compressor at the machine shop on 5th Street, and a boiler that had been running wrong since November. He clocked out at 10:30 that night, got into his truck and drove toward home. The rain started 3 miles out. He didn't want to stop. He was tired, his back ached from the compressor job, and the rain was falling hard enough that his wipers were losing the argument. But the Route 7 shelter appeared in his headlights, with a woman still underneath it, motionless upright, like she had been sitting there long enough to forget. It didn't make sense to still be there. The last bus on that route had run 2 hours ago. He pulled over, called out from the truck window. Nothing. He got out and walked toward the shelter. She was in her early 30s, white dark hair soaked flat against her face. No jacket, no bag, nothing in her hands. Her eyes were open, but they weren't following him. They weren't following anything fixed on some point in the middle distance that had nothing in it. He got within 5 feet of her, and she spoke first. "Don't take me anywhere they can find me." Then she said his name. Not Sir, not Hey Clinton. Exact and deliberate, the way you say a name when you've had it memorized for a while. He stood in the rain and did not move. He brought her to the truck. Not because he had a plan, he didn't, but because driving away wasn't who he was, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise about small things a long time ago. She sat straight in the passenger seat, both hands resting flat on her thighs, not reaching for the door handle, not asking where they were headed. She moved through the darkness, the way someone moves through a room they've had time to prepare for. He asked how she knew his name. "Not yet," she said. He asked where to take her. "Somewhere they won't think to look," she said. Clinton turned onto Maple Street and let those answers sit. His house was at the end of the block, small two-bedroom, dark inside. He walked her to the front door without taking her arm. She hadn't asked for help, and something in how she carried herself made clear she didn't expect any. Inside, he set her up on the couch with a dry towel and a glass of water. She thanked him quietly. He went to check on Theo, found the boy asleep with one shoe still on his foot, pulled the blanket up and came back to sit alone in the kitchen with what he'd just let into his house. He hadn't worked it out yet when he heard small feet in the hallway. Theo appeared in the kitchen doorway, spotted Kaisa at the table she had moved from the couch at some point, both palms flat on the wood surface, head tilted slightly like she was listening to something underneath, and didn't ask who she was. He just climbed into the chair across from her. My grandma used to sit up like that at night. Dad says it's because she missed my grandpa and the nights felt too long. Kaisa didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful. "You're not afraid of me." Theo thought about it the way he thought about everything seriously without performing it. "I don't see you doing anything bad." 7 years old, clean and certain. It landed somewhere in Kaisa that she hadn't expected anything to reach in a long time. Clinton stood in the hallway and didn't say a word. In the morning, Clinton came downstairs to find Kaisa already at the kitchen table. She had been there for a while. He started the coffee set, a mug within her reach, and brought 2 plates to the table. When he leaned across to move her cup a few inches closer, the back of his hand caught hers 1 second, maybe less. She pulled back fast. Her face went pale in a way that wasn't fear, more like someone absorbing a sharp physical impact they hadn't braced for. "You have a clock you've never finished fixing," she said quietly. Clinton didn't move. "It isn't that you don't know how. You've known how for a long time." Her gaze settled just past him, the way it always did, reading the air behind him rather than his face. "You haven't fixed it because finishing it would mean accepting something you're not ready to put into words." He sat down slowly across from her. She explained what had happened without making it strange. When she made deliberate skin contact with another person, she could sometimes access their most emotionally weighted memories, not their current thoughts, not what they intended, only the moments that had left the deepest marks. And she didn't just observe those memories, she felt them, the grief, the guilt, the tenderness, all of it entering her chest, like it was her own. "That's why I don't touch people without choosing to," she said. "And I don't choose to touch people whose pain I'm not willing to carry." Clinton looked at her for a moment. The contact a minute ago had not been accidental on her end. He turned toward the window. A gray car was parked at the far end of Maple Street, engine idling. He hadn't noticed it when he came downstairs. 15 minutes later, when he checked again, it was gone. He turned back to Kaisa. "How did you know my name?" She kept her hands flat on the table. "Let me tell you the rest of it first. Then that part will make sense." She told him what she was willing to tell him, and she told it plainly. Her father was Victor Whitmore. He had founded a company called NeuroBridge, a neurotechnology firm with federal contracts, research grants, and a clean public reputation. Beneath all of that was a program that had nothing to do with its filed mission. The program used real people. It had used her. She had been 24 when he asked her to participate. She was blind by then, had been since 19 after a degenerative condition the specialists hadn't caught in time. Her father framed it carefully. This was a chance to contribute, to do something meaningful with what she had left. She said yes. She hadn't understood yet that her father collected things and that she was one of them. The experiment gave her the ability. It also stripped everything else away: her privacy, her autonomy, her right to a memory that was only hers. Every emotional experience she had was logged, analyzed, and filed. She hadn't known that part until much later. 6 months ago, she found out he had been selling it. Not just her data, the data of dozens of other subjects gathered over years, sold to corporations and political operators who wanted leverage over people. She spent 2 weeks quietly gathering what evidence she could, and then she ran. When Clinton didn't say anything for a while, she asked if he believed her. He didn't answer that question. He asked a different one. "Are you hungry?" She went still for a moment. Then, "Why aren't you asking whether I'm telling the truth?" "Because I've spent enough time around broken things to know the real ones when I see them," Clinton said. "You're not performing." He stood and moved toward the stove. She didn't say anything after that for a while, but she didn't leave the table either. That was enough for both of them. The days that followed settled into a shape neither of them had planned on. On Thursday morning, the day after Clinton brought Kaisa home, he left for work before 7. Before he went, he set food on the counter within her reach. Coffee already made toast whatever came together without much trouble. He didn't announce it. She didn't thank him for it. It became a fact of the morning the same way his boots by the front door were a fact. Kaisa learned the house without asking for help. She walked the rooms carefully that first day, trailing her fingertips along the walls, counting steps between the kitchen and the bathroom, finding the edge of the hallway rug with the toe of her shoe. By Friday, she moved through the space the way a person moves through somewhere they've lived for years, not carefully, just naturally. When Theo came home from school each afternoon, he talked at her without pause. A kid in his class who could burp on command. Whether sharks dreamed. The different types of clouds he'd been memorizing from a library book. Kaisa listened in the way she listened to everything completely, without interruption, asking the occasional question that arrived exactly where the story needed it. Theo took this as enthusiastic agreement and kept going. On Friday evening, rain came steadily against the windows. Theo fell asleep on the sofa mid-chapter in his book about deep-sea creatures. Kaisa sat at the other end of the couch with one hand resting lightly on the closed cover, not reading it, just holding still, in that way she had like she was listening to something the room wasn't saying out loud. Clinton stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the two of them. It was the first time the house had felt inhabited by more than grief and routine. But outside those walls, things had already been shifting. The gray car that Clinton had first noticed Wednesday morning appeared again on Thursday, then twice on Friday, once early on Maple Street, once in the parking lot of the machine shop by afternoon. On Thursday night, the silent calls started. No voice, a few seconds of open line, then a click. On Friday afternoon, Clinton was on the phone with Theo. Theo had called from school to ask about poster board when he heard it. A faint, hollow echo riding under the line. The kind of delay you hear when a signal is passing through something it shouldn't be passing through. He kept his voice even. "Yeah, I'll get the poster board. Big size or regular?" He waited until Theo said goodbye and the call ended. Then he sat in his truck in the parking lot and looked at the phone in his hand for 3 full minutes without starting the engine. That evening, after Theo was in bed, Clinton found Kaisa still at the kitchen table. The lamp above it was on. Through the window, rain came at a slow, steady angle. He made coffee he didn't particularly want and sat across from her. "You want to trust me?" Kaisa said. Not as a question. He didn't argue with it. "But you're not sure you have the right to," she continued. "Because the last time you trusted something that mattered to you, you lost it. And you've been telling yourself ever since that trust is something you have to earn back before you're allowed to reach for it again." Clinton turned his cup in his hands. She wasn't touching him. Her hands were folded on the table, still well away from his, which meant she was doing it the ordinary way, reading the room by everything except sight, the way she'd been doing her whole life. He asked what she was suggesting. "Let me hold your hand for a moment," she said. "I'm not looking for anything new. I want you to understand who I am not, through what I've told you, but through what you feel when you feel what I feel." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laid his hand on the table, palm up. She placed hers over it carefully, the way you place a hand on something you're uncertain will hold. She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice came slow and quiet. There was a Saturday morning in March. He was supposed to drive, but she said he looked tired and she wanted to. He let her. Clinton went very still. He stood at the front door and watched until her car reached the end of the block and turned the corner. And in that last second, while he could still see it, he thought just for a moment that he wished he were in it. Not because he was worried about her, just because he missed her even before she was out of sight. Kaisa lifted her hand. Her face had gone pale in a particular way. Her eyes, which never fixed on anything visible, were red at the edges not from crying, but from receiving. She had been carrying that memory inside her chest since the moment she touched him, and it sat in her now exactly as it had sat in Clinton for 3 years, heavy, quiet, and shaped like something that didn't have a name yet. Clinton kept his eyes on the table. "I didn't say anything before she went," he said into the quiet between them. The car was already around the corner. Kaisa's voice was careful. "That wasn't guilt. Guilt is when you did something. You just loved her before she was gone. That's a different thing entirely." He didn't respond for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had found its level again. "Why did you choose me, the real reason?" Kaisa's hands rested on the table. A full beat went by, then another. It was a specific kind of quiet, not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but of someone choosing which version of the truth to offer. "Let me answer that separately," she said. Clinton looked at her evenly. "That's not a no." She told him the following evening without being asked again. Before she ran, she had been alone in the Nuremberg server room for nearly 4 hours. Whitmore had called it a calibration session, a routine check of her ability scheduled every 6 weeks. He left her with a technician who stepped out twice and stayed out the second time. Her father had not considered her capable of using the system against him. He had spent years watching her navigate the facility by touch and memory and sound, and somewhere in that watching, he had made the mistake of seeing only the limitation, never the precision underneath it. She had been suspicious long before she found the financial records. The calibration sessions had felt wrong from the beginning. The questions the technicians asked, the particular way her emotional responses were cataloged, the way her father sometimes referenced private memories she had never spoken aloud. It took nearly 2 years of careful observation during those sessions, going a little further each time, before she found the file structure that showed her exactly what was being done with what she gave them. Then 6 months ago, she found the transactions. She spent 2 weeks verifying what she had, and then she ran. Nuremberg had spent years reducing human emotional experience to signals to files to indexed rows in a database. There were thousands of profiles, ordinary people from towns across Ohio and Pennsylvania who had enrolled in what they were told was a voluntary cognitive study. None of them knew the scope of what had been extracted. Clinton Hale was in the files. His record was linked to a connected entry, a digitized memory fragment from a former neighbor of his who had enrolled in the study 3 years earlier. The memory itself was unremarkable. A man in work clothes helping an elderly woman carry groceries up an icy front walkway in January. It lasted a few seconds. But the person who had held that memory felt something while watching it, a particular kind of recognition, the way you feel when you see something genuinely good in a place where you stopped expecting it. Through that fragment, Kaisa had not just seen Clinton. She had felt the shape of him. When she finished, Clinton stood up from the table. "So you chose me," he said. "I didn't find you by accident. You were waiting for me specifically." "I chose you because I needed someone I could trust," Kaisa said. "You needed me." He stopped in the doorway. "That's not the reason I wanted to hear." He walked out of the room. She didn't call after him. She sat with her hands on the table and let him go because she had nothing honest left to add, and she had been lied to enough in her own life that she had no interest in doing it to anyone else. On Monday, a man in a dark suit appeared at the machine shop where Clinton was 3 hours into a compressor replacement. The man didn't raise his voice. He set a sealed envelope on the workbench beside Clinton's tools and said in the tone of someone relaying a message rather than delivering a threat that Mr. Whitmore wanted Clinton to know that his daughter was in a condition that required professional care. that if Clinton genuinely wanted what was best for her, the right thing to do was allow the appropriate people to bring her home safely. Clinton looked at the envelope without touching it. He picked it up once the man had turned toward the door. Inside was a photograph. Theo at the school gate that morning, backpack over one shoulder, caught mid-step on his way through the entrance. Clinton set the envelope back on the workbench. He picked up his wrench. He went back to the compressor. The man left. 3 minutes passed before his hands stopped shaking. The pressure that followed came from every direction. His supervisor called Tuesday morning to say Clinton's hours would be reduced, a slowdown in contracts, he said, which wasn't true, and they both knew it. 2 neighbors on Maple Street had started looking away when Clinton came home in the evenings. Someone had been talking to them. Darnell called Wednesday afternoon and said, without making it sound like more than it was, "Something going on with you. People are asking questions around town, the wrong kind." Clinton thanked him and kept it short. He knew he could not call the police. He had thought about it carefully enough to know how the picture would read from outside: a black man in a small Ohio town keeping an unaccounted-for woman in his home with a well-resourced corporation claiming she needed to be returned for medical reasons. He was not under any illusions about where that story ended up once it entered a system that had not been built with him in mind. He had known this about the world for a long time. It did not make him bitter. It made him careful, the way you learn to be careful about things you cannot change, and clear-eyed about what tools he actually had. Kaisa heard the call with Darnell. She was in the back hallway when Clinton's voice dropped into the register it went to when he was managing something. A photograph of Theo at the school gate, Clinton losing work hours, neighbors changing their behavior. She had walked into this man's house carrying everything Whitmore had sent after her, and it had reached Theo's school gate before she'd even thought to consider the cost. She had chosen Clinton because a stranger's memory told her he was good. She had not fully calculated what that goodness would be made to pay. That night, after Clinton had put Theo to bed and walked back down the hallway, the living room was empty. The towel she had been using was folded neatly over the arm of the couch. The cup from that morning had been rinsed and placed on the drying rack beside the sink. On the kitchen table there was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, too large, in places slightly slanted, the letters formed by muscle memory rather than sight. But the words were exact. "I was wrong to choose you. Not because you aren't trustworthy, because you deserve more than what I brought to your door. Please take care of Theo. That boy sees the world the way most adults have long since forgotten how." Clinton stood at the table and read it twice. He didn't go after her. He stood there for a long time trying to separate the right decision from the easier one, and the line between them kept moving every time he reached for it. He folded the note and set it back on the table. Then he sat down. Outside, the rain had returned, not hard, just that low, even kind that had no urgency to it. It came against the kitchen window with the same patience as everything else in Ellsworth at that hour. He didn't turn the lights on. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with the yellow streetlight coming through the window, falling in a long diagonal across the table, across the floor, stopping at the edge of the hallway. After a while, he got up and lifted the clock off its nail above the stove. He carried it back to the table and set it down in front of him. He didn't reach for the screwdriver. He just looked at it. The crack in the glass. The white face. The hand stopped at 7:42. He had known how to fix it for a long time. He had hung it back on the wall every morning and said tomorrow, and tomorrow had come and gone, and the clock had stayed the same. But it wasn't only the clock he was sitting with. He had spent the last week angry at Kaisa for having chosen him, before she met him for having arrived at his door, already knowing his name, already decided that he was the person she needed. He had told himself that the foundation of something real couldn't be built on necessity, that being needed wasn't the same as being chosen. But sitting in the dark, he had to be honest with himself about what he'd actually been doing these past 3 years. He had stayed still. He had called it caution. He had held every door just barely open and told himself that was living. Kaisa had looked at a 12-second fragment of a stranger's memory and decided he was worth crossing a county for. He had spent 3 years deciding he wasn't worth the risk of starting over. She needed him, yes. But she had also seen him more clearly through the dark than he had managed to see himself. From the back hallway, Theo's breathing came at its familiar rhythm, small and even and steady. Clinton put both hands over his face and held them there. He didn't cry. He simply stayed in the silence, the specific kind that arrives when a person stops bracing long enough to take honest stock of where they are. He let his hands fall. He looked at the clock on the table. Then he stood up, picked up his phone, and called Darnell Webb. When the line connected, he said, "Darnell, I need you, right now." Darnell arrived 20 minutes after the call. He sat down at the kitchen table, looked at the clock Clinton had left sitting there, and didn't say anything about it. Clinton walked him through everything. Kaisa, Whitmore, Nura Bridge, the server room, the photograph of Theo. He told it the way he'd been holding it for days, in order without editorializing the way you describe a mechanical failure to someone who knows how to listen for the part that matters. When Clinton finished, Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That land company I mentioned at the coffee shop, out of Columbus money trail going nowhere. Nura Bridge is the parent entity. I ran it down after you left that morning." Clinton looked at him. "They've been here longer than Kaisa," Darnell said. "She picked Ellsworth because the data said you were here. But Whitmore already had roots in this county before she ran. He wasn't chasing her into unfamiliar territory. He was waiting." Darnell still had contacts inside the FBI's Cincinnati field office, people who would take a call from him seriously provided that call came with something they could use. Kaisa's word on its own wasn't enough. What they needed was documentation she could deliver directly, names, accounts, specific transactions, something that moved through a federal system. "If she has what she says she has," Darnell said, "and she can sit down with the right person and put it on the table, that's a different conversation entirely." He looked at Clinton steadily. "But she has to choose to do it herself. Nobody can make that call for her." "I know," Clinton said. "I need to find her first." He knew she hadn't gone far. She was on foot in a town she had only navigated for a week, and she had chosen Ellsworth because she had already mapped it in her mind before she arrived, which meant she knew where the safe places were. There was an all-night diner on Route 7, a quarter-mile from the bus shelter, where he'd found her. He drove past it, just before 3 in the morning, and saw through the window a figure sitting at the far end of the counter with both hands around a coffee cup. Not moving, not looking at anything. He didn't stop. He drove home and let her have the rest of the night. The public library on Cedar Street opened at 8:30. Clinton was there at 8:45. He found her in a corner near the back wall, seated at a table with her hands flat on the surface. Her coat was dry. She had been inside long enough to stop being cold. He sat down in the chair across from her without announcing himself. She knew it was him before he spoke. He had come to understand that she always did. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Probably not," Clinton said. He let that settle. "Theo asked where you went this morning. I didn't have an answer for him." Kaisa's hands stayed flat on the table. "You're afraid," Clinton said, not as an accusation, just as the fact it was. "Not of Whitmore. You've been running from him for 6 months, and you know exactly what he is. You're afraid that trusting someone was the wrong instinct. That you let yourself believe something and it's going to cost you the way it always has." Kaisa didn't deny it. "I've been afraid of the same thing," Clinton said. "For 3 years. I got very good at staying in place and calling it caution." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to do that anymore." Kaisa's face turned toward him the way it always did, not at him, exactly, but precisely oriented to him, finding him without sight with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to everything else. "You just used your own memory to talk to me," she said quietly. "I learned from the best person I know at it," Clinton said. For the first time in the entire conversation, something in her face let go. She told him what she had not told him before. During every calibration session over nearly 2 years, the technicians had placed her in physical contact with staff members as part of the protocol. A handshake at the door, a hand on her shoulder to guide her to the chair, a brief touch at the wrist to check a monitoring sensor. These contacts were considered procedural, routine. No one in the facility had ever once asked what she was receiving through them. She had been careful. She never reacted in the moment. She held whatever she gathered, the way she had learned to hold everything quietly in the part of herself that no one had access to, which was the only part of herself that had always remained entirely her own. She had not collected the personal lives of those people. What she had gathered were the memories adjacent to the work figures discussed in passing transactions that had produced guilt or relief-specific details that carried weight because something consequential had happened around them. She held account numbers that a finance officer had mentally reviewed the night before a quarterly audit. She held the name of a senator whose chief of staff had arranged a private meeting that had left a particular residue of satisfaction in the person who secured it. She had never written any of it down. It existed only inside her in the one place her father had never been able to reach. "I can give them enough," she said. "More than enough." They arranged to meet Darnell at his house at noon. 2 hours later, as Kaisa sat at Darnell's kitchen table, beginning the careful work of translating 2 years of gathered memory into names and dates and figures, Clinton stepped outside. He was on the front walkway when a dark sedan pulled up to the curb and 2 men got out, the kind of men who looked like they had driven from somewhere and were not planning to stay long. Clinton stood in the middle of the walkway and said calmly that he had spent the previous evening putting together a summary of certain information and sending it to 3 local journalists and 1 reporter he knew in Cincinnati. He said that if he didn't make a specific phone call within the next 15 minutes, that information would be passed along for publication. The 2 men looked at each other. Clinton waited. After a moment, they got back into the car and drove away. He went back inside. It was a performance entirely. He had contacted no journalists, sent nothing to anyone. The only number in his recent calls was Darnell's. But the 2 men hadn't known that, and that was the only thing that needed to be true in that moment. He poured himself a glass of water and went back to sit with Kaisa while she worked. The FBI field office in Cincinnati opened a formal inquiry 8 days later. Nurabridge's financial accounts were frozen within 2 weeks of that. The process was not fast or dramatic. It moved the way federal investigations move methodically through channels, one document building on the next. Kaisa worked with 2 agents over the course of 4 days, sitting across a table from people who asked careful questions and wrote down careful answers, and for the first time in years, the things she knew were treated as evidence rather than liability. Victor Whitmore was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning in the lobby of the Nurabridge headquarters building in Columbus. He did not resist. He was dressed the way he was always dressed, precisely without a detail out of place, and he walked with the agents the way a man walks when he has already calculated that fighting is no longer worth the energy. At the entrance to the building, one of the agents reported later Whitmore had asked a single question before the handcuffs were applied. He had asked whether Kaisa was all right. No one answered him. 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning, Kaisa was still in Ellsworth. There was more to do than she had anticipated, more follow-up sessions with the federal attorneys, more names to account for, more documentation to work through. She had also, without quite deciding to, stopped moving like someone who was about to leave at any moment. On a Thursday afternoon that came in cool and clear, she and Clinton sat on the back steps while Theo ran in the yard. He was narrating something to no one in particular, a story that had started with a very large bird and evolved through logic only available to 7-year-olds into a situation involving a submarine and a diplomatic misunderstanding. Kaisa laughed. Clinton heard it happen, not a polite sound, not the careful version she'd offered before, but the real one, sudden and unguarded, arriving before she'd had a chance to decide to allow it. "He's going to be fine," she said when it had passed. "I know," Clinton said. He went inside for a moment and came back carrying the clock. He said it on the step between them. She heard it before he said anything, the faint, steady tick of something that had been silent for 3 years, now running clean, and even in the cool afternoon air. "You fixed it," she said. "This morning," Clinton said. "I knew how to do it for a long time." "This time you didn't stop halfway through," Kaisa said. "This time I knew what I was fixing it for." The clock sat between them on the step, keeping its small, steady time. In the yard, Theo had added a weather event to the submarine situation. The sky above was the pale, thin blue of early October, the kind that doesn't last but is exactly right while it does. It was the most ordinary afternoon Clinton had spent in 3 years. It felt completely different from all the ones that had come before it. Kaisa left on a Friday morning 2 weeks later. The car that Darnell had arranged came early and quiet. Kaisa walked to it without hesitation, navigation built from weeks of learning every step between the front door and the curb. There were other people who had been part of Whitmore's program, most of whom still didn't know what had been taken from them, and who deserved to know. There were things she needed to face on her own terms, and she intended to. Clinton and Theo stood on the front porch. Theo watched the car until it reached the end of Maple Street and turned out of sight. "Is she coming back, Dad?" Clinton kept his hand on his son's shoulder. "I don't know," he said, "but some people don't come into your life to stay. They come to show you something you'd stopped being able to see on your own." Theo thought about this in the way he thought about everything. "Like Mom." Clinton looked down at him. "Yeah," he said, "like Mom." That night the rain returned low, and even the same patient rain that had been falling the night all of this began. But this time, the kitchen light was on. Clinton sat at the table with a blank piece of paper and a pen and began to write something that was not for anyone else. On the wall above the stove, the clock ran steadily quietly, the way it had always been meant to. There's something about a story like this that stays with you after it ends, not because it's extraordinary, but because somewhere in it, something feels true. Clinton wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had gotten very good at standing still and calling it surviving. And Kaisa wasn't waiting to be saved. She had been building her way out for 2 years quietly, in the only space no one could take from her. What happened between them wasn't rescue. It was recognition. 2 people who had both learned to expect very little from the world, seeing each other clearly enough to decide to try again. If this story moved something in you, it would mean a lot if you shared it with someone who might need it today. And if you've been watching this channel for a while and haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. Every story we tell here is made for people who still believe that ordinary lives can hold extraordinary grace. We'd love for you to be part of that. Drop a comment below and tell us, is there someone in your life who has ever seen you more clearly than you've seen yourself? We read every single one.